This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for April 27th, 2022. And a lot of information is coming out every single day. I didn't think that I was going to be doing another update so soon, but sure enough, a lot has been coming out. So I'm going to go over a briefing from the Pentagon, as always, but also, as a matter of fact, I'm going to start with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, this news conference that he did after what they're calling the Ukraine Defense Consultative Group meeting. This was at Ramstein Air Base, Germany. This is the, Friends of Syria style format where they bring in all of these countries and they all talk about what weapons they can flood the country in question with. Friends of Syria, obviously, they were pumping weapons, money, and training into terrorist organizations operating in Syria. And now they're doing it in regards to Ukraine. And of course, we remember how the situation in Syria ended up. These terrorists that they were arming and backing and training, trying to train standing armies and send them into Syria. That's not how war works, and it didn't work. As soon as Russia entered the conflict, at the request of Syria, they destroyed the supply lines, and the fighting capacity of these arms groups collapsed. They made contact with the enemy all across the country. They sent a designated assault group around the country from city to city, taking them back. And most of Syria's most populated cities are now back under the control of the Syrian government, with the exception of Idlib and territory to the east of the Euphrates, which is occupied by the US and its proxies. And it's a standstill, it's a stalemate there. And I think there are many parallels. And as I go through this, you're going to see how a situation like that could take shape in Ukraine. So let's start with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, this news conference after the Ukraine Defense Consultative Group meeting at Ramstein Air Base. And of course, I have all of this in the video description below. This is the transcript. And also, if you go all the way to the bottom, there's actually a video, so you don't have to read through all of it. And I'm going to go over a few points, and then, as I always do, I'm going to bring in other relevant information to help explain and make sense of what they're talking about. So before we even get started, how about a full disclosure here? Defense Secretary Austin came into this position as Secretary of Defense from the board of directors of Raytheon. Raytheon makes the Javelin and the Stinger missile. So the anti-tank Javelin missile and the anti-aircraft missile, the Stinger missile. And they do that, they co-produce it with Lockheed Martin. There's different systems that they contribute to make these. And actually going to get into the Javelin and the Stinger missile here in a little bit. That's Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. He is helping perpetuate a war in Ukraine to hurt Russia. This is his own words. He said they're doing this to hurt, to degrade, to undermine Russia. A proxy war, fought to the last Ukrainian, and in the process make billions and billions of dollars for a company that he was just on the board of directors of. Keep in mind, when you listen to people like Secretary Austin and the people around him, when they talk about how they're fighting for democracy, this massive conflict of interest that he's involved in, how it's going completely unaddressed, how he is helping perpetuate a war that is making billions for the company he sat on the board of directors of. Just keep all of that in mind. This talk about democracy, defending democracy and Western values, this is a smokescreen behind which these horrific crimes are conducted. So let's get into the briefing. First, he announces that this consultative group meeting will take place every month. So they're going to do this every single month. He also announced that the U.S. arms industry needs to ramp up production, and they're going to do that with huge sums of cash from the U.S. government, from the U.S. taxpayers. So again, he was on the board of directors of Raytheon, and now he's saying, well, we need to ramp up production. So you're going to get contracts for these companies. You're also going to help invest so they can ramp up production. There's only so many missiles they can make in a given amount of time. And as a matter of fact, the Stinger missile, they say they're not going to be able to even begin making them until at the earliest next year. And it takes 32 months to replenish Javelin missiles. And I got a couple of articles here, right here. As Raytheon struggles to replenish Stinger missiles, lawmaker pushes Defense Production Act. So that's Secretary Austin saying that, and that is what's going on in Washington right now. They're trying to find even more money for these arms manufacturers. Secretary Austin also was very happy about Germany sending these 50 Cheetah. These are anti-aircraft systems. They're tracked vehicles. Here, take a look at this. This is from Defense News. Germany sending Gepard air defense tank to support Ukraine defense. And essentially what it has is 2 autocannons with a range of 4,000 meters. You could also attach missiles to it. But I haven't heard anything yet indicating that they're going to send missiles along with these old, outdated platforms that were just sitting around that Germany wasn't even using. This is what they're sending. And I think this is a good opportunity to talk a little bit about air defense and why Stinger missiles and these Cheetah or Gepard, whatever you want to call them, these platforms, why they're not going to really help Ukraine at all. It'll be a nuisance at best on the battlefield, because air defense is something that you need to have layers of, and you need to network it together. You have to network all of these radars together so that the targets can be tracked by everyone, and whoever has the best shot can take it. And you have to have different systems with different capabilities arrayed to take down anything that is flying, whether it's high altitude, or long range, or fast and low to the ground. And Russia has this capability. Ukraine does not have this capability. And this Gepard Cheetah system is not going to help. And shoulder-launched Stinger missiles are not going to help. Yes, they are a menace. They are a nuisance. They will force Russia to change its tactics. It will force them to be more careful. But it is not going to change the course of the war, and it is not going to stop Russia from using its air power, obviously. If and when these Gepard systems reach Ukraine, there's going to be only 50 of them, and what it's going to do is just be another thing that Russia looks for when they're sweeping an area that they are interested in and will use air power over, sweep it to make sure that there is no danger to its aircraft. That's all that's going to do. It's just be another target for Russia to hit. And again, the autocannon has a range of 4,000 meters. There are many aircraft that Russia employs that can hit targets from much further off than 4,000 meters. As with all of these heavy weapons, there's going to be weeks of training if you want these systems to be employed effectively. If you just want them to be able to drive it down the road, squeeze off a few shots, then maybe not. But to be used effectively, it'll take weeks at the least, much longer, most likely. And then, of course, this is a system that Ukraine doesn't have, so all of the spare parts will have to come from Germany. The maintenance crews will either have to be trained alongside the operators in Germany, or they are going to have to send these machines back to Germany or to the far rear or to Poland or to somewhere to be repaired by German mechanics. So it's not practical. This is not actually practical aid for Ukraine. Just like with all of these other systems the U.S. is giving them. The U.S. and its allies are giving them. I want to talk about air defense. I want to show you how much more complicated it is than just shooting missiles into the air. So this is from CSIS Missile Defense Project. CSIS is a U.S. government and U.S. corporate funded think tank. I've referenced them many times in the past. These are the think tanks that come up with U.S. policy, which is then crafted into a bill by lawyers and sent to Washington with lobbyists. That is how U.S. policy actually works. And so when they talk, people should listen. They publish all of this publicly. And in this case, they're talking about Russia's air defense. And it says During the Cold War, the Soviet Union invested heavily in its air defense systems. As a result, Russia now possesses some of the most advanced air and missile defense systems in the world. That is a U.S. government-funded think tank saying that. That is not Russia's arms exporters saying that. Current Russian air defense doctrine follows a three-tier approach. This layered system allows Russian air defense forces to create anti-access area denial zones that can be difficult to penetrate. The highest tier of these defensive networks uses long-range systems such as the S-200, S-300, and S-400, providing air defense bubbles potentially up to 800 kilometers in diameter. These zones are typically augmented by the second tier, which includes medium-range systems like the 9K-37 Buk and its variants. This medium-range layer is intended to increase radar coverage within the air defense zone and augment the more limited inventories of longer-range interceptor missiles. The third tier uses mobile short-range systems like the 9K-33 Odessa and S-125 Neva to provide extra protection for key areas such as military bases. These systems, along with highly mobile systems like the 9K-37 Buk, are often also attached to formations of ground forces in the field. One more article about air defense, this one from Business Insider, and this was about the conflict in Syria. Russia's newest anti-air defenses are in Syria, and the U.S. should be worried. And just think about the situation in Syria. The U.S. and also Israel and also Turkey have been very careful when working around Russian forces there because they have a high level of respect for their air defense systems. The U.S. did not invest as much in air defense because they relied heavily on the concept of air superiority granted by the U.S. Air Force, their air superiority fighters. So this Business Insider article says the two systems working together in tandem provide a layered defense, with the S-400 providing long-range protection against bombers, fighters, jets, and ballistic missiles, and the Pantsir providing medium-range protection against cruise missiles and low-flying strike aircraft and drones. And this explains why that long column of armored vehicles and supply trucks that were right at the doorstep of Kiev and went all the way back to the border with Belarus, why that just sat there for over a month and Ukrainian air power was unable to touch it because of Russian air defense. That is also the reason why Ukraine doesn't have an air force anymore, why they're begging for aircraft. There's that. So you're sending these Gepard platforms, 50 of them. You have all of these shoulder-fired missiles, but none of this can create the type of network that Russia has that is so effective at defeating Ukrainian air power. They had these Bayraktar drones from Turkey that everyone was talking about how formidable they are. And they are a capable platform, but not against a nation with capable air defense. It's just another target to be detected and shot down before it can really do any damage at all. And the few successes that Ukraine's Air Force had was taking out forces that were out from under that air defense umbrella. And okay, so let's get back to the briefing. Secretary Austin's also talking about Canada sending 8 armored vehicles. So again, these are token signs of support. This is not practical. That's 8 vehicles out of hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 vehicles that Ukraine has lost to the point where they're driving around in vans and pickup trucks because all of their military vehicles have been destroyed. There's also talk about Germany providing other types of heavy weapons like tanks. And I saw this article from U.S. News about Germany waiting to get approval from the government, this company in Germany waiting for approval to send 50 tanks. What kind of tanks? Leopard 1 tanks. The Leopard 1 tank is a post-World War II design. It was designed in the 1950s. It is very much obsolete, but let's just say they sent the Leopard 2, for example. Let's just say they sent the Leopard 2. As I've said before regarding tanks, sending tanks to Ukraine that are not Soviet designs that they're familiar with, it could take up to half a year to train a capable tank crew. And then again, you have all of the issues of fueling them, transporting them, because you don't just drive a tank all the way across the country. You put them on a train, you put them on a truck. You do not just drive them all the way to the front line because of maintenance. And when they break down, again, Ukrainians are not going to be able to fix them. There are things that you are going to need a warehouse of German spare parts and German mechanics to work on them, to fix them and get them back into action. So again, completely impractical. And even if all of those issues could somehow be overcome, you're still faced with this fact. This is from the National Interest, and it says Turkey's Leopard 2 tanks are getting crushed in Syria. And this article says, again, all of these articles are going to be in the video description below if you want to read through all of them. It says, in December 2016, when evidence emerged that numerous Leopard 2s had been destroyed in intense fighting over ISIS-held Al-Bab, a fight that Turkish military leaders described as a trauma, according to Der Spiegel. A document published online listed ISIS as apparently having destroyed 10 of the supposedly invincible Leopard 2s, 5 reportedly by anti-tank missiles, 2 by mines or IEDs, 1 to rocket or mortar fire, and the others to more ambiguous causes. And that was to ISIS. These are irregular fighters. Russia, obviously a much more capable and well-organized and better equipped fighting force. Germany sending, they're saying 50 Leopard tanks. Again, we'll just bog down manpower and just end up destroyed alongside all of Ukraine's tanks that they started the war out with, that are now gone, necessitating these sort of very desperate attempts at aiding Ukraine and its efforts. Also, during this news conference with Secretary Austin, someone asked about Moldova. You know, he really didn't answer the question. I mean, he has no idea what's going on there, and he just said they're investigating it. And I want to show you this Business Insider article, this one right here. In Transnistria, controlled by pro-Russia separatists, a fear of war and a toast to the death of Putin. And this is a really revealing propaganda piece. It cannot be taken seriously as journalism, but it is a piece of propaganda that is trying to create a narrative and a justification for escalation around this conflict. This article attempts to portray whoever is, there's these terrorist attacks in Transnistria, which is a breakaway part of Moldova. And they're trying to act as if the attacks inside this pro-Russian breakaway region, is somehow Russia trying to create another front. And take a look at the map here. Okay, this is Ukraine. This is live uamap.com. It is very pro-NATO, pro-US, pro-Ukraine. And you can see in red, this is territory that Russia currently holds. And Transnistria is right here. And you see this big gap here. Right now, Russian forces who hold the city of Kherson, they're trying to advance on Nikolaev. Beyond Nikolaev is Odessa. If they were able to take Nikolaev and Odessa, then yes, Transnistria would be very well within reach of Russian forces. But as it is right now, that is not the case. If there was some crisis, security crisis in Transnistria, it would be a logistical nightmare for Russia. They have no way of inserting a sizable force there, you know, depending on what Ukraine actually does to threaten Transnistria. They have no way of inserting and then supplying a sizable force to do anything regarding Transnistria. If they can reach Odessa, then yes. If Ukraine's combat capacity is degraded enough, then possibly they could do an amphibious operation and build some sort of logistical bridge from the shore to Transnistria. That's possible, but only if Ukraine's combat capacity is significantly degraded, and I don't think that it's there yet. So someone trying to escalate around Transnistria is someone other than Moscow, who definitely right now is not in a position to take advantage of that. What I can tell you, though, is that if that happens, if they do that, if Ukraine does this to try to escalate, because it's complicated. Moldova is very close to Romania. Romania is an EU member and a NATO member. Ukraine is trying to escalate this and drag in the EU and NATO. That's what they're trying to do. It all depends on how Russia reacts to this. Now, they could just turn up the intensity further within Ukraine. And by that, I mean, this was really a special military operation. It was not a full-scale war. It still isn't. Up until now, Russia has been sparing Ukrainian infrastructure, but because Ukraine is also hitting targets inside of Russian territory, they have started taking out more and more essential infrastructure, including the railways. This BBC article, Ukraine Roundup, Russia hits railways as U.S. pledges extra weapons. Russia hit railway infrastructure across Ukraine on Monday with the aim of disrupting foreign weapons supplies, while the U.S. declared it would provide more weapons despite Moscow's objections. So that is what awaits Ukraine if they decide to move against Transnistria. Again, I don't think that Russia is in any position militarily or logistically to support a major operation in and around Transnistria. I really believe that it's Ukraine trying to escalate here. And if they do, I believe that Russia will just turn up the intensity inside Ukraine. I do not think that they're going to want to involve the EU or NATO. But again, in a situation like this, only time will tell. Now, the Business Insider article said a couple of other interesting things, though. One, it says, Transnistria is the site of a former USSR ammunition depot that is believed to be one of the largest in Eastern Europe. The statelets railroads, which use the same broad gauge track as Ukraine and Russia, are seen by analysts as a potential resupply route for the railway-dependent Russian military if the war eventually comes to Odessa. This is projection. Who needs ammunition more than anyone? Ukraine, not Russia. They have their own factories that make ammunition, and they send it to the area of focus, which is right now eastern Ukraine. If they go at Odessa, it'll be very far down the road. We're not anywhere near that yet. And so they're not going to create a conflict around Transnistria. Now, the only one who would do that would be Ukraine to get their hands on that ammunition, to deny it. Russia down the road when it is time for Russia to move on Odessa, if they do. And so this is the Western media trying to create out of thin air some narrative that tries to make it as if it's Russia through Transnistria and Moldova trying to escalate this when it's very obviously Ukraine. And the Business Insider also admits, in order to avoid confrontation, Moldova, its constitution committing it to military neutrality, has condemned the war in Ukraine and accepted more refugees per capita than any other nation. But it has refused to allow its territory to be used for the transfer of weapons. It has also declined to sanction Moscow, and it's not requesting any new weapons from its allies in Washington and Brussels, fearing that would put a target on its back. And why would Russia target Moldova versus why would Ukraine do it? Again, cui bono, who benefits from this the most? Right now, it's Ukraine. To wrap up, Secretary Austin's press conference, getting back to that, there were questions asking for Secretary Austin to expand on him wanting to weaken Russia through this conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And he's claiming that Russia has lost a lot of men and equipment and precision munitions. He also claims that sanctions will prevent Russia from replacing a lot of these capabilities. Someone else also asks him, whether or not down the road Ukraine could still become a NATO member. And completely unrepentant, he says, yes, they still can. The door will be open and they can still become a NATO member. And again, what is this about? This is about using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, bleeding it dry, to weaken and undermine. Russia has nothing to do with helping the Ukrainian people. This is one of a long line of proxies the U.S. has used throughout recent history. And then when they're done, they dump these countries. Ukraine is going to be dumped after this is done. They're going to use it for as long as they can against Russia. Say somehow Ukraine gets through all of this, and what the U.S. is basically saying is as soon as this is all over, we're going to go right back to militarizing it and creating a threat on Russia's border. That is basically what they're saying. And then finally, someone asks him about Russia's warnings about the use of nuclear weapons, about pushing them into a corner, triggering a nuclear war, essentially. Secretary Austin says that's bluster. It's irresponsible, but it's just bluster. And someone sent me a video. It was on DW. It's this guy, Alexander Wittman. He's a retired lieutenant colonel. Alexander Wittman, he's the former director for European Affairs for the United States National Security Council during the Trump administration. He was born in Ukraine, and he speaks fluent Russian and Ukrainian. And he also says that Russian talk about nuclear war is just pure propaganda. He says this war right now that Russia is fighting with Ukraine is motivated by Russia wanting to expand its power. It's a repeat of this narrative that the West claims that Russian President Vladimir Putin is trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. And they're completely ignoring the fact that this is actually an existential threat to Russia. The expansion of NATO onto its doorstep, militarization of Ukraine. You're leaving out, he's leaving out, and people who say this are leaving out the fact that the U.S. and its allies raided Russia economically after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They helped sponsor 2 wars in Chechnya inside of Russia's borders, a separatist war that would have carved territory off of Russia. In addition to the NATO expansion, the U.S. and its NATO allies have attacked and destroyed allies of the former Soviet Union and of the Russian Federation. We're talking Iraq, Libya. They attacked Syria. They're still occupying part of Syria. And in 2008, the U.S. was arming and training and equipping the military forces in Georgia who attacked Russia. That was an EU report that concluded that Georgia, not Russia, started that conflict. And so when you add all of that together and you look at this pattern of behavior from the West, it is very clear that Russia feels threatened. They can see this encirclement. They can just listen to someone from the Atlantic Council talk about how eventually they'll absorb Russia. And this fight that they're fighting is not to expand their power, it's to preserve their existence. And so people like Alexander Wittman claiming that this talk about nuclear wars is just bluster, it's propaganda, they don't mean it. That is a miscalculation if he actually believes that. And the reason someone sent me this video is they wanted to know if he really believed this or if this was just him reciting propaganda. You can watch it. I put the link in the video description below. You can watch it. You tell me whether you think he's really buying his own story or he's just making things up to push an agenda. And since we're talking about Alexander Wittman, we might as well cover the other things that he mentioned because they're reoccurring themes across the Western media. He claims that Russia didn't assemble enough troops to take over Ukraine. No, they didn't, because that wasn't their objective. Russian President Vladimir Putin, the day it started, this military operation started, said the goal was to demilitarize, denazify, and defend Donbas. That was the 3 objectives of this operation, and that's what you see them doing from the beginning all the way up until now. That is what they're doing. He also says Russia may not even achieve the limited, he says they scaled back their goals. They might not even achieve those in the east of the country because he's claiming it's taking them so long. But if you look at the amount of territory, the front line, how long it is, from Kharkov in the northeast all the way down to Kherson and Crimea, it's a huge front. That is not a minor thing, and to make things happen along that front takes time. He says Russia gave up in Mariupol. They tried to take the city, but they couldn't. He said they only managed to reduce the Ukrainian forces' footprint in the city. And what he's talking about is Azovstal Steelworks. There's a single industrial complex that whatever is left of Ukrainian forces in Mariupol, they're all hiding underground there. They're running out of food and water and ammunition. They're injured, literally rotting to death underground, completely cut off from the rest of Ukraine. He also says that Russian forces are moving out of Mariupol because they gave up trying to take it. So they're leaving Mariupol and they're just leaving a few forces behind. And he said that, because of that, it makes the territory permeable, which means, Ukrainian forces could break in, or the forces trapped in Azovstal could break out. And it was my wife who heard me reacting out loud to this video when I was watching it. She says they're rotting to death in the basements. A lot of them can't even get out from under their blankets. How are they going to get out of the city? And that really does sum up the situation in Mariupol, and the fact that people like Alexander Vindman, the Pentagon, and the Western media as a whole still claiming that Mariupol is contested, or that there's some sort of chance for the trapped fighters underground in the Azovstal Steelworks. It just goes to show you the level of deception that is taking place here regarding the conflict in Ukraine. They are subjecting the public to this level of deception. This is why you can't talk to people who are buying into it. And that brings me to this. This is a press conference, AP. It's on YouTube. The link's in the video description below. Zelensky, Ukraine army unable to unblock Mariupol. And they have kind of like the answers here in the video description below. And I'll read you what Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said. There are two ways to unblock Mariupol. The first one is serious, heavy armed help that we and they, Ukrainian troops in Mariupol, are counting on. With common actions, we can unblock Mariupol. At the moment, we don't have enough of this hardware to work in this direction. The second way is diplomatic. Russia doesn't agree on it yet. There's no way for them to get out. They don't have the military forces required to break into Mariupol. If anything that Alexander Vindman said was true, then the president of Ukraine wouldn't be admitting that Mariupol is unsolvable. And then Alexander Vindman, just like everyone else in the Western media, in the government, policymakers, think tankers, they're all saying the same thing, and they're saying we need to send more weapons. And Vindman says it needs to be a lend-lease program. He says the equipment needs to be staged in Europe. Just have huge amounts of equipment in Europe, and when Ukrainians need it, you just send it in. You keep it there to keep the Russians from destroying it, and you just send it in as they need it. But the problem with this is that what Ukrainians were trained on is not what NATO has in its inventory. That's the problem. It takes weeks, even months, to train soldiers to use this equipment effectively. They don't have that kind of time. This is a retired lieutenant colonel, and he seems completely disconnected from the actual reality of fighting a war. And so let's get into more of these weapon systems that they're sending and creating, new units to go into the fight. Let's go to this U.S. Department of Defense senior defense official and senior State Department official hold a background briefing. This is April 24th, 2022. So what are they talking about? They're talking about foreign military financing. And they say this $713 million in FMF, this includes funding for Ukraine and 15 other allied and partner nations in Central and Eastern Europe. So this funding, it's going to provide support for training, especially for the fight in Donbas. This system will also help Ukrainian armed forces transition towards advanced weapons, air defense systems, essentially NATO-capable systems. So training a whole army how to use completely different equipment than what they've had. And there's another problem here that they're not talking about that they cannot solve, and I'll get to that in just a moment. They also talk about sending in these U.S. howitzers. And so they say tomorrow, the first tranche of more than 50 Ukrainian artillerymen will complete their training. It's in a country outside Ukraine We're still not identifying that country, but the training is going well and wraps up tomorrow. And they will, it will be a short turnaround, and there'll be another tranche of more than 50 Ukrainian artillerymen at the same location to get another 6 days worth of training on these US howitzers. 6 days of training. That's all they're getting. And they're going to have the exact same problem with these howitzers that they will have with every other major weapon system the West is sending that is not already in Ukraine's inventory. The fact that the first time it breaks, they're going to need spare parts that are only made for that type of howitzer that they don't have on hand. How are they going to repair it? I don't see the answer to that. And who's going to repair it? Because training people to fix these howitzers, that's also a very extensive process. And I don't see any of the answers. So what's going to happen is these howitzers are going to go to the front line. They're going to get off a few rounds, just enough to get Russia's attention and be destroyed. Along with the over 1,000 artillery pieces Russia already claims that they've destroyed in this conflict. And people say, well, why do you believe that Russia actually destroyed over 1,000 artillery pieces? Well, because Ukraine is reduced to sending people outside of Ukraine to learn how to learn a whole new system, because the ones that they have are gone. They also talk about the necessity of finding non-NATO standard ammunition. And I've talked about this in a previous update, how when they say they're sending 50 million rounds to Ukraine, that sounds like a lot, but it could take between 250,000 to 300,000 rounds to kill a single combatant in modern warfare. And 50 million rounds does not get you a lot. You need much, much more than that. And I've talked about how Russia most likely makes more than 1 billion rounds a year. That's what they're drawing from. 50 million is a drop in the bucket in comparison. They also took this, this State Department and Defense Department official, these two officials, they also talked about moving U.S. diplomats back to Kiev. And again, the purpose of this is to continue to trick Ukraine into going along with this war, to make it look like the U.S. is standing with them as they bleed the country to its very, very last drop of blood. That is all that is. And, when you hear Alexander Vindman, it sounds crazy when you hear someone say that Mariupol is still contested, but he's saying it and you're saying, well, he's retired. He doesn't hold any significant position right now. So what? So he says that. Well, the Pentagon says that. It says, and this is a quote, "We still consider Mariupol contested. The Ukrainians are still there. We still assess that they are resisting Russian efforts in Mariupol. Mariupol continues to be the target of bombardment, airstrikes, and artillery from Russian forces that are around Mariupol." And he makes it sound like Russian forces are still outside the city trying to get in. They have the entire city except for Azovstal Steelworks, an industrial complex right on the coast. And that's where all of these whatever's left of Ukraine's military in Mariupol is underground in these Azovstal Steelworks. They have no fighting capacity. They're done. They're just trapped in there and they refuse to come out. They have probably enough ammunition to make storming the steelworks costly, but they don't have enough to break out. They don't have enough to continue fighting above ground, which is why they're all hiding underground. That is not a city being contested. And then this briefing discussed other types of training that the U.S. is providing and U.S. allies are providing. And I just want to remind people that this training is not going to make any difference. I've heard Western military experts, people like Michael Kaufman, who's on an almost weekly podcast on War on the Rocks, and he's talking about how the advantage is with Ukraine because the U.S. is sending all of this equipment, NATO is sending all of this equipment, and they could start rebuilding brigades. You might have on the ground in front of you enough equipment for an entire brigade, but do you have the manpower, especially the experienced manpower needed for decision-making and leadership, to pick up that equipment and go into battle? And the answer is no. A brigade is between 3,000 and 5,000 soldiers. So someone like Michael Kaufman is going to say that Ukraine can reconstitute brigades or create new brigades. It could take years to create a functioning, effective brigade of 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers. Let me show you what it took to get Ukraine to where it was at the beginning of this conflict. This is from Wall Street Journal. The secret of Ukraine's military success, years of NATO training. And this article says, through classes, drills, and exercises involving at least 10,000 troops annually for more than 8 years, NATO and its members helped the embattled country shift from a rigid Soviet-style command structure to Western standards where soldiers are taught to think on the move. This training was done under relatively ideal conditions. And this type of training cannot happen now, not inside Ukraine. And even if it could, you cannot do it at the pace needed to regenerate Ukraine's losses. This is an article from Forbes. This is February 1st, 2022. This is before this most recent conflict began. They're talking about the 92nd Mechanized Brigade. And they say this is one of the best that Ukraine has. The brigade boasts 2 T-64 tank battalions and 3 battalions of infantry and BTR-4 wheeled fighting vehicles, plus attached artillery, engineers, air defenders, and support troops. Each battalion fields around 40 armored vehicles and around 400 troops. This is one of Ukraine's best brigades at the start of this conflict. And if you come down here toward the end of the article, it says, today, the 92nd appears to be fully manned and equipped, thanks in part to foreign assistance and training courtesy of British advisors. One brigade alone can't stop a Russian invasion force that might include scores of brigades, overseeing 100 or more battalion task groups, plus huge quantities of supporting artillery. But it doesn't have to. The Ukrainian army fields 20 active brigades, plus another 4 brigades in reserve. And then there's all of those volunteers, the Nazis, Azov, Aidar, and Right Sector. There's all of them. That's what they went into this conflict with. That is the force that could not stop Russia from taking Kherson in the south, or encircle and take Mariupol, or stop them from the beginning of this operation in Donbas, where they're going to encircle and destroy whatever's left of Ukraine's military there. And that is what they had at the beginning. That is not something that they can reconstitute. That took years to create, and now it is gone. And they cannot replace that faster than Russia can take it off the battlefield. That is a fact. Ukraine's whole military is involved in this conflict. Russia's is not. They have their pipelines still going, bringing in conscripts, and by the way, releasing conscripts. There's no stopgap. They are letting conscripts whose term is up go home. They're still producing basic infantry soldiers, artillerymen, tankers, and they're also still producing leadership. And they can draw from that if they need to. Ukraine cannot. Their entire military is in this, and it's being mauled every single day. And then to wrap up this second briefing that I'm talking about, they discuss the situation in Donbas and how Russia is encircling all these Ukrainian forces, which brings me to the situation in Donbas, and this is where we'll leave it. I was directed to this Politico article, this one right here. Politico, heavy weaponry pours into Ukraine as commanders become more desperate. Russian forces are attempting a pincer movement on Ukrainian forces in the Donbas. Will Western artillery, tanks, and drones get there in time? And I would add, will it make any difference even if it does? And I don't think that it will. And I was directed to this article by the Duran. The Duran does geopolitical analysis. It is excellent. They are on YouTube. They are on Rumble. They are on Telegram. I will put the link to their different platforms in the video description below. If you're not following them, you should. You should be. So let's read a little bit from this Politico article. It says, 80 miles north of the city, First Lieutenant Ivan Skuratovsky, serving in the 25th Airborne Brigade, told Politico that help needs to come immediately. The situation is very bad. Russian forces are using scorched earth tactics, the 31-year-old married father of 2 said via text. They simply destroy everything with artillery, shelling day and night, he said via text. He fears that if reinforcements in the form of manpower and heavy weaponry, particularly air support, don't arrive in the next few days, his troops could find themselves in the same position as those in Mariupol. Guratovsky described his soldiers' situation as very desperate, and I'll just add that if you follow this conflict via Telegram and you see the photos and videos coming out every single day, what he's saying in this Politico article is what you see in photos and videos from the Ukrainian side and also from the Russian side. So let's continue. I don't know how much strength we will have, he said, adding that the troops under his command around the city of Avdiivka near Donetsk, and this is the city where they shell Donetsk from and kill civilians on a regular basis. I just thought I'd throw that in there. Have gone without rest since the start of the war. At least 13 of them have been wounded in recent weeks, he said, and they are running dangerously low on ammunition, reduced to rationing bullets. I've talked about the ammo shortage before, and I've talked about how what the U.S. is sending them is not enough. So they will always be low on ammunition, and Russia has what is essentially, in practice, an indefinite supply of ammunition. The day before, he told Politico, his soldiers were being bombarded with Russian howitzers, mortars, and multiple launch rocket systems at the same time. Of course, this is the quite essential method of waging war for Russia. Just hours earlier, he said, they had been attacked by 2 Sukhoi 25 warplanes, and our day became hell. Guratovsky had a message for the United States and other NATO countries. I would like to tell them that grenade launchers are good, but against airstrikes and heavy artillery, we will not be able to hold out for long. People can no longer endure daily bombardments. We need air support now. We need drones. Unfortunately for this Ukrainian first lieutenant trapped with his dwindling number of men in the Donbas region, nothing that the US and its allies send is going to change anything. Even if somehow they were able to come up with a whole new air force to hand over to Ukraine, it would just get shot down again. Russia has, as I've explained at the beginning of this video, the best air defense systems in the world, even according to the West itself. The West does not have comparable air defense systems to give Ukraine. That means that Russia is going to shoot down everything Ukraine puts up into the air, and Russia is also going to be able to continue using its air power, I wouldn't say with absolute impunity, but almost anywhere and at any time they desire. The only way the situation in Ukraine could be turned around is if NATO decided to intervene directly. And I wouldn't discount it, and I wouldn't underestimate NATO's fighting capacity. What I would say is the most likely scenario is NATO entering Ukraine, probably at the very last minute, securing some sort of buffer zone like they did in Syria. They have experience encroaching on Russia without provoking a full all-out conflict. I guess it would be a race between Russia to accomplish all of the objectives that it has in Ukraine versus NATO figuring out a way to justify entering into Ukrainian territory and establishing a buffer zone that would preserve a functioning Ukraine after all of this is over. And what it looks like is that Russia is going to try to completely take Ukraine's coast and leave whatever's left of Western Ukraine landlocked and essentially a failed state. And this escalation that looks to be brewing in Moldova and Transnistria, this could be some sort of precursor to a move made by NATO to try to preserve Odessa and at least a part of the coast, to preserve Ukraine and its access to the sea as some sort of functioning nation state when this is all said and done. But that remains to be seen. I would not count on Russia sitting there and not reacting to that. This is a very dangerous situation, so we're going to have to just wait and see how it plays out. We'll keep an eye on it. If anything major happens or if more information comes out, I will do another update. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. If you're watching this on YouTube, check the video description below for other places you can find my work, just in case YouTube decides to delete my channel. I'm on Odyssey, I'm on Rumble. I'm also on Telegram, very active on Telegram. In the video description below, you're going to see all of these links that I went over. They're all listed there. I tried to organize it the best that I can so you can find whatever it was that I was talking about. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and through PayPal. To everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. I could not do this work without that support, so thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.